Matt Buff, your host in the easy chair right here in the Liam Fitzpatrick studio. Make sure you send all your 2A questions into the info@thebuffshow.com. On the first Thursday in February, we're going to have Alex from Veritas answering those questions. But there's a lot of other questions going on, which is just unbelievable when it comes to the Biden agenda and what's going on with the 3 million jobs lost due to employer closures or lost businesses. We have an all-time high 4.5 million people quit their job in November. And then the U.S. economy just added a dismal 199,000 jobs in December. Those are people just going back to work. Nobody better to talk about this than Mark Mix, joining us on the show, president of the National Rights to Work Committee, which is a 2.8 million member public policy organization. He also serves as president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Mark, welcome back to the Buff Show.
Matt, good to be on with you. And as the new year passes, lots of news to talk about for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Give your website where people right up at the top can find you.
Yeah, they can find us at nrtwc.org. That's the National Right to Work Committee, where there's information about legislation, not only in Congress here in Washington, but across the country in your state legislatures as they start to gear up again, introduce new bills and new statutes and new regulations that will have an impact on you. So you can find information about that there. At the foundation, our Legal Defense Foundation, nrtw.org, you can find out answers to questions or talk to an attorney about your rights in your workplace. And vis-a-vis unions, the foundation represents employees for free, and you can find information about that at nrtw.org.
Okay, very good. And we'll post those links everywhere on thebuffshow.com/Mark Mix too, everybody. So make sure to check that out. Mark, I tell you what, when the Build Back Never thing finally went down in flames, that was a power grab for the unions. A lot of people don't realize that. And the Democrats, as long as they hold power, they're going to fight to make this a unionized country as much as they possibly can.
Yeah, that's right. You know, Matt, we called it the Build Back Big Labor Bill because there was so much in there that was going to go not to rank and file workers and help them, but to union officials and give them dramatic new powers over workers so they can force more workers into unions. I think I've heard you say this before. It's kind of this vicious cycle. You know, the government grants this money, sends it out. It goes to the union officials. They use it to elect more politicians that give them more power. It's this vicious spiral. And in that so-called Build Back Big Labor Bill, one of the major provisions in there was just the fact that anything that was going to be built, any infrastructure, anything that was going to be built from that bill was going to be done with union labor because they were going to use prevailing wages and Davis-Bacon. And we know that when you favor them, when basically only about 13% of the construction industry is unionized, you're basically saying we're willing to increase the cost from 10 to 30% to do anything with federal money in it. And that's really inflationary, and it hurts taxpayers, it hurts citizens, and it hurts non-union workers across America as well. And, you know, this president keeps saying he'll be the strongest pro-union president or union president in the country. What he really means is he's going to favor union officials over rank and file workers.
Yeah, he's made no bones about that. I mean, that's one thing he does speak clearly on. When it comes to everything else, is a little muffled. But I tell you what, when he talks about unions, he talks about it like in an old style American way. You know, the old 455 down the street at the coal mine. That's not what it is. We saw what happened with the teachers union, which has got to be abolished. Public sector unions are just getting more powerful under this regime, and that is what controls so many other entities in our society. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly, Matt. And I appreciate you bringing that up because, you know, it used to be 5, 10, 15 years ago when you talked about schools and you talked about teachers unions. I mean, the vision that came into my head was my third grade teacher, Mrs. Baker. She was the nicest teacher I'd ever had in my life. I mean, first day of school, there was a full-size candy bar on my desk. And boy, she won the hearts and minds of her students that first day. And we were behaving ourselves and obedient. And so when you talked about a teacher, I thought about Mrs. Baker, and I think most Americans do. They've got a favorable opinion of a teacher in their history. But now with COVID, the last 2 years have exposed the dramatic power of not teachers, but teacher union officials. And so the American public has gotten a chance to see the type of power they've been granted over children, over taxpayers, over superintendents, over school boards, and frankly, over the CDC and the White House. When you think about, you know, the recommendations to open up the schools again, they don't go to a scientist in Atlanta. They go to a union boss in New York City to say, hey, how should we open up schools again? So hopefully this exposure will convince taxpayers like the moms in Loudoun County, Virginia here that got outraged over what Terry McAuliffe said and said, hey, your parents shouldn't be involved in education. Hopefully this is a wake-up call for America. And Matt, you're right. I mean, the idea that we're unionizing government workers, Franklin Roosevelt knew that was just unfathomable that you would do that. George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO, you shouldn't do that. The executive council of the AFL-CIO, we can't organize government workers. It's not the same. But yet today in America, as we stand here and talk, there are more government union members in the United States of America than there are private sector union members. That's a problem we have to deal with.
We have to deal with that and have to change. McAuliffe said that in Virginia. Might have cost him the election because when they tell their true feelings on the left, people get scared and see what happens. And there was also a referendum on the Biden regime, too, when Glenn Youngkin took his oath the other day and then goes out there and put some executive orders on. One of the first thing he did was go right to the unions, basically, and say no more CRT and no more masking of kids unless the parents approve it. Those were direct attacks on union rules right there. And so when you vote, your vote can make a powerful difference in the freedom for your citizens as well as right to work.
Yeah, that's exactly right, man. If there's no other takeaways from our show today, that's the one, is that we've got to be involved at the lowest level of government to the highest level of government. And the fact that we have a turnout differential from a presidential year to an off-year election is really embarrassing. We should be as actively involved in the races that are coming up in 2022 as we would be in the presidential race in 2020 or 2024. I mean, we just can't let the left continue to control the levers of government. And frankly, Matt, you know this. I mean, Florida's a little better than some states, and your governor's been a little more outspoken on this than many governors. But when you give up and you concede the school board, or you concede the city council, or you concede the county commission, or you concede, state elections, you're really giving the power over to folks that have this agenda that's really contrary to what most Americans believe. We've seen that with the teachers unions at the level of the school districts.
Yeah, that 10-point flip you talk about in Virginia was pretty massive, and we're seeing it across the country in other smaller elections. So that gives us very big hope heading into 2022. We need good, strong candidates that believe in the right to work, believe in the personal freedoms, the medical freedoms, and all that. So I agree with you completely, Mark Mix, when you say that this election needs to be treated like a presidential election. Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, it really does. And I think, as people look at the political landscape, and I think the radical left looks at it and they think they're in trouble. We think that probably the wind's behind our back when it comes to the issue of forced unionism. And we think that 2022 should be a good year for individual freedom and workplace rights and those type of things. And even if it's not, Matt, we've been through seasons of great harvest and we've been through seasons of great drought, and we've continued to fight for individual freedom. And I think that fight is growing, the intensity and the interest in a fight for individual freedom, because of the mandates and this kind of top-down, push-down government regulation we're seeing. And no place exposes that better than organized labor officials getting this power over rank-and-file workers. I mean, you talk about Joe Biden being the most pro-union president in history. Well, if you're an operating engineer or you're a welder or pipe fitter on the Keystone Pipeline, you wonder why your union endorsed him and spent your money to elect him when you're on the unemployment line today. Yeah,
then they spent your money to elect him, and then they fired you, and then they shut it down.
Yeah,
and then pro-union. It's pro-union. Go ahead, Mark, but it's pro-union only as long as it fits their agenda going forward.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then you expand that out to the energy sector, and you think about, basically suspending leases for energy exploration. A lot of those jobs are union jobs too, and they're wondering what the heck happened with electing the most pro-union president in American history. He said the word union more than anyone else. We know that.
How much does supply chain issues is affected by union overlords?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's one, notwithstanding this transportation secretary saying it's solved, and, Marty Walsh running around saying we saved Christmas, and Jen Psaki saying they saved Christmas.
You can say Psaki. That's fine.
Okay, I do. And I shouldn't, but Jen Psaki. But yeah, they say that they want it. Matt, there are more ships waiting to be unloaded in Long Beach and Los Angeles today than there has been at any time. There's 105 ships as of the 5th of January sitting out in that harbor, or to try to cover it up, they push them out 50 miles out and make them still move so they're not quite at anchorage, so they don't count. The bottom line is this: the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union out there is very powerful. They're in a year where they're in a contract negotiation. Every time we have a contract negotiation in these ports, and they control the 29 ports on the West Coast, including Long Beach and Los Angeles, where 40% of all the imports for the United States of America come through those two ports. On the East Coast, we have the International Longshoremen's Association. They control the 15 ports on the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. And, we've got a port there right now, Matt, that basically the newest, most efficient port built in the United States is a port called the Hugh Leatherman Terminal in Charleston, South Carolina. I looked at the schedule today. There is not one ship in harbor, in anchor, being unloaded at the newest, most efficient port in America. And the reason is very simple. The union, the ILA, filed a lawsuit against two of the largest container shippers in America and said, if you go to that port and unload, we'll file a lawsuit against you, which they did, a $300 million lawsuit that's pending in New Jersey right now that basically is scaring everyone away from the newest, most efficient port in the United States in the middle of what everyone recognizes as a supply chain crisis. That's the power of unions on the dock.
See, I'm really glad you brought that up because a lot of people want to talk about it. They're confused by it. And like Trump said at his rally, nobody talked about supply chain before. And now so people are trying to figure it out. And I knew that there was an underbelly of union control silencing this. Why are they doing this?
Well, it's about power. I mean, when you're negotiating a contract, you want to make things as bad as you can because it forces the shippers and the port management to basically come your way in negotiations. And so we've seen a strike. In 1971, I think it was, there was a 100-day strike. We saw a strike in 2012 out there, job actions. I mean, it's about power. And, it's about legislation, too. In California, the so-called AB5, Assembly Bill 5 bill that passed back in 2018, I think it is, was designed to basically take away the status of independent contractors in the United States, well, in California. Now it's in the PRO Act, so they're trying to do it nationally now. But here's what it does. When we think about independent contractors in the debate over AB5, we were thinking Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, gig employees, journalists, freelance journalists who were doing, writing pieces for various platforms. But, one of the real impacts was in the independent owner-operator truck business. Basically, what they said is that if you're doing business at the port, if you're a truck driver servicing, using the chassis to take the containers to the warehouse or to an intermodal head somewhere or into the economy, you had to be an employee of a motor carrier. You couldn't be an owner-operator. So 70% of the work was being done by independent owner-operators at the port in Los Angeles and Long Beach, and they said you can no longer do work there. Now, Matt, don't be surprised and hold on to yourself now. Be careful because this may shock you. But you can't unionize independent owner-operators, but you sure can unionize employees. So what it was a power grab for union officials to basically increase their ranks, get more dues money, compulsory force dues money, to spend on politics to give them more power, that vicious cycle that Matt Buff talks about.
That's right.
There it is.
Well, that's insane. And we got to do something about that. And that's what these midterms are for. That can help with that. That's a start. Mark Mix, can you stay with us for one more segment? We got to dive into this economic numbers.
Absolutely. Glad to stay with you, Matt.
All right, we're going to head into our last segment here with Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and of course, the National Right to Work Committee. We'll be right back on The Buff Show. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Buff Show, heading into our final segment. Matt Buff with you here in the Liam Fitzpatrick studio. Great to be with you. We're going to go right back in our interview with Mark Mix. He is president of the National Right to Work Committee, 2.8 million member publicity policy organization. He also serves as the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Mark, thank you for rolling along with us on The Buff Show. Got a question for you on what the talking points are when it comes to the Democrats' spin on the economy. They always come out with the unemployment rate number and the stock market. Let me ask you a question about the unemployment number. We look at all these jobs leaving the workforce or maybe going somewhere else. Where do they get the 3.5%?
Yeah, Matt, the economic numbers, I mean, it's hard to believe anything now that comes out of this White House. They talk about the lowest unemployment ever, but if you look at the workforce participation numbers, which really is a better indicator of where we are still below where we were in January of 2020 as far as the workforce participation. I mean, basically, they're not counting people that have given up or are not looking for work. And, when you think about what's happened over the last 2 years, when you pay people more money to stay home than they can make on the job, you've really disincentivized work. And I know that a lot of those benefits have quote unquote gone away. But if you look at like Wisconsin or Michigan, I think it came out with a story the other day. There was an audit there where $8 billion in unemployment fraud was discovered. I mean, 44 billion was discovered. I think 8 billion they got away with. I mean, the idea that the government's pumping all this money into the economy is giving people the chance to basically sit on the sidelines. You know, you can't go anywhere, whether it be Orlando or Paducah, Kentucky, and not see "we are hiring" signs at basically every single job site or business on Main Street across America. I mean, there's plenty of jobs out there. I think we're lacking something like 12 million. We're looking for 12 million new employees out there, and people just aren't doing it. And I think some of it has to do with the government intervention, their government finger on the scale as it relates to, suspending rent payments and suspending, I think, student loan payments now have been forgiven for a bunch of people. There's been all kinds of stories about things like that. And the bottom line is the economy. Look, my wife and I went to the grocery store over the weekend. I'm telling you, the inflation is high and it's beginning to be noticed by everybody. And you can't paper over that, no matter how smiley you are or how optimistic you are when you're on the teleprompter.
Well, that's exactly right. And when they talk about wages, they say wages are up. But when you add the 7% inflation, that's the highest since 1982, those wages going up means absolutely nothing when you and your wife go to the grocery store.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that 7% inflation number is kind of a protective instrument for government because, their interest payments are predicated on what the interest rate is. Their Social Security payments are, cost of living adjusted. So they have an incentive to keep the cap on inflation. But go to the gas pump. Gas prices are up, 45, 50%. We went and got some ground beef the other day. We're not eating steak anymore, Matt. We're eating ground beef, $19 for a couple of pounds of ground beef. I mean, you look at rents are up 25%. Used cars are up 20%. Home mortgages are up. I mean, the inflation, I haven't seen a 7% number on basically anything except maybe a computer or a big screen TV has gone down in price. But otherwise, the stuff that you and I need to live day in and day out, the prices have gone up astronomically.
Oh, that's just what we need. More TVs out there so people are in shape. That's a great thing. But no, it's unbelievable. And back to the previous segment when we talked about the bare shelves, even in states like we have in Florida with ports and states with ports, we're starting to see bare shelves down here, and it's worse in some areas. And when we talk about these economic numbers and they try to spin it with wages and low unemployment rate, it's just a spin job because Americans, like you said, they're feeling this every single time they go out and buy something.
Yeah, that's right. And if you watch Jen Psaki at her press conference, the sign right behind her back says the White House, and every once in a while she'll move her head just enough so it says the whitewashing. And it's there's irony there. It's no conspiracy. You can watch it and you'll see it. Whitewashing, and that's what it is. I mean, from an economic standpoint, and the supply chain matters. That hurts too. A lot of shipping companies are now coming through the Panama Canal. They're coming up to the East Coast, going into the Gulf, whether it be Miami, Orlando, Wilmington, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, New York City, New Jersey. But the cost of that additional 2 weeks of carriage time on those containers, who do you think pays that? So, the supply chain blockade out on the West Coast, where a lot of the imports come in, is basically causing an increase. And the Biden administration says they solve it by charging fees on containers that are left a certain amount of time on the docks. Well, if the cost of maintaining or storing a container on the dock goes up, who do you think pays for that? We do. And so, it's just a lack of economic literacy, if you will. Somehow, I guess if you're a big government person, you believe government does everything right and is responsible for everything in the decisions that you and I make, Matt, because we're just not smart enough to do it ourselves and understand it. The fact is, large retailers have basically responded by, basically contracting their own ships, bringing them to the East Coast now. And even the East Coast is starting to build up a little bit at few of the ports around on the East Coast. So still problems there. It's not going to get better for 6-8 months, probably.
No, it's not. What's going to make this bubble burst here? I mean, we can't just keep paying higher prices for everything. I mean, it just seems like the gas prices, for example, are going to continue to go up. I mean, when will this burst?
Yeah. You hate to talk about that, but ultimately I think that's going to happen. If you think back in the Reagan years, the end of Carter, beginning of Reagan, I mean, Paul Volcker gets on the Federal Reserve Board as chairman, and what does he do? He jacks up interest rates to what? 15, 16, 17, 18%. That killed, and if you had debt, you were in big trouble, but it basically slowed everything down enough to basically bring it back to normal. I think the rubber band stretched even farther this time when it comes to government involvement. I mean, you can't pump $7-8 trillion into the economy, load up that debt, and think that everything is going to be fine. It's not. And the bottom line is that inflationary element's part of that. I mean, I know there's arguments from a lot smarter people than me about inflation, but when you supply $7 trillion into the economy, these are fiat dollars that go in there and they get spread out into the economy. More money chasing the same amount of goods. Guess what, Matt? Raises prices. I mean, this is economics 101. I learned a little bit in college, not a whole lot, but that I do know that. I mean,
right.
It really is amazing. And so when does it burst? I hate to say that it will, but I think it's going to have to. I mean, remember, we were energy independent just about a year and a half ago. We were actually exporting energy to other countries, and now we're dependent upon, once again, on OPEC and foreign countries for our energy needs. I mean, you can't make this many mistakes, Matt. It doesn't seem right. It's impossible to make this many mistakes. So I don't know what's up with these people.
Yeah, and we're talking about just completing year one. You talked about being energy independent a year ago. Look at how much damage has been done in just year one. I mean, we can go on and on about this when they're talking about we've created the most jobs ever in a first year of a president. No time in our history did we completely shut down the country and then open it back up and people went back to work. They're counting that as a new job.
Yeah, it really is amazing. What is that called when they adjust inflation? If stakes are too much, they use here. It's called hedonics. I think that's the right. I may not have pronounced that right.
But they use the term transitory.
Yeah, a lot of hedonics in this. But getting back to our issue and forced unionism, I mean, one of the objectives of the Biden administration now is to repeal all 27 right-to-work laws, including Florida's. And we know this, Matt. Where there's new investment and there's new growth, it's the right to work states. That's where companies are investing. That's where people are moving because that's where the jobs are. And yet the objective of this administration is to repeal all right to work laws across the country and reimpose that federal power that forces workers to pay union dues or fees to get or keep a job in America. That type of policy, first of all, violates individual freedom, but secondly, has economic impacts that we really can't even guess about what they'll be when they force everyone back into unions and pay union dues.
No, that's unbelievable. Because the Supreme Court case that you're talking about that actually gave employees the right to leave their union and still keep their job. Is that the one you're talking about with Flores?
Well, that's just in the public sector. That was our case.
That was Janice, right?
Yeah. The foundation litigated that case at the U.S. Supreme Court back on June 27, 2018. The Supreme Court voted 5-4 that said no government worker anywhere in America, at the lowest level of government to the highest level of government, could be forced to pay union dues or fees to keep their jobs. In the private sector, there's still compulsory forced unionism that's imposed on the nation by the federal government. So Florida has passed a right-to-work law. 26 other states have passed a right-to-work law. But in 23 states still in America, Matt, you can lose your job if you don't pay dues or fees to a private organization. And Joe Biden wants to expand that and impose that back on even the 27 right-to-work states. That's not good economic policy either.
Well, if they could overturn that Supreme Court case, they certainly would. They certainly would.
Yeah, that one was a constitutional First Amendment question, Matt. We'd been litigating all the way back to 1977. A case called Abood was our case as well at the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. And we argued that this compulsory unionism scheme was violative of the First Amendment. And of course, the court said, well, we can't go that far, so we'll slice off a piece of it. And over the course of that 40-year period, we had 6 cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court that dealt with the public sector forced unionism. And each time they sliced a piece off, tried to regulate it. When we finally got to the court with Janice, they looked in the deli compartment, deli fridge. There was nothing left to slice except the First Amendment. And finally, we won constitutional First Amendment protections for every government worker in America.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate the work you guys do. Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee, also president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Keep up the great work and give the websites one more time.
Yeah, Matt, you keep up your great work too. And people can find us at nrtwc.org for the committee and the legislative work, and nrtw.org for the legal work.
Okay, that'll do it. But we'll get those links on thebuffshow.com. Mark Mix, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure, Matt. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. That'll do it for this evening's edition of The Buff Show. You stay smart out there. We'll see you next time.